"Sir, you dropped this, but why is my mother inside your wallet?" The question was so small, so honest, that it should have disappeared beneath the noise of Midtown Manhattan, swallowed by taxi horns, rolling suitcases, and the wet hiss of tires along Fifth Avenue after a late afternoon rain. But instead, it cut through everything. Jonathan Whitmore stopped halfway beneath the gold awning of the Langham Hotel, one hand still raised toward the waiting Blacktown car, his silver hair catching the pale reflection of the city lights. Around him, people moved like they always did around powerful men, quickly, carefully, pretending not to stare. His driver held the rear door open. His assistant stood 2 steps behind him with a phone pressed to her ear. A hotel security guard was already moving toward the little girl who had spoken, his expression shaped by habit more than cruelty, the look adults used when they had already decided a child did not belong. She stood near the curb in worn purple sneakers, the left lace tied with a piece of white string. Her coat was too thin for the March chill, but it was buttoned neatly all the way to her chin. Her hair was braided into small, careful rows, each braid tipped with a faded blue bead that clicked softly when the wind touched her. In both hands, she held a black leather wallet as if it were something fragile, something that might break if the world looked at it too hard. Jonathan turned slowly. At 52, he was the kind of man magazines described with words like untouchable, disciplined, self-made. Even though half the city knew old money had opened the first doors before his mind and ambition built the rest. He had walked through Senate fundraisers, hostile boardrooms, courtroom cameras, and charity galas without showing fear. But now, on a damp sidewalk in front of a 5-star hotel, a child no taller than his chest had made his face go still. "What did you say?" he asked. The girl swallowed, but she did not step back. The security guard reached her side. "Sir, I'll handle this." "No," Jonathan said, without looking at him. The guard froze. The girl lifted the wallet a little higher. "You dropped it by the revolving door. I was going to give it to the front desk, but it fell open when I picked it up." Her voice trembled only at the edges, like a candle fighting the wind. "There's a picture inside. The woman looks like my mom." Jonathan's assistant lowered her phone. The driver's hand tightened around the car door. Somewhere behind them, a bellman stopped rolling a luggage cart, and the wheels gave one soft squeak before silence gathered around the curb. Jonathan stared at the wallet. Black leather, Italian stitching, initials pressed into the corner, JW. He knew every card inside it. He knew the emergency cash folded behind the license, the museum membership he never used, the old hotel key card he kept for no reason he could explain. But the photograph was different. He had not looked at that photograph in years. He had told himself he carried it only because forgetting required more courage than remembering. "Give it to me," he said softly. The girl did, but not quickly. She watched his face the way children watch adults when they have learned that truth can be dangerous if placed in the wrong hands. Jonathan opened the wallet. His thumb knew the hidden slit behind the inner fold. The photograph slid free with a faint scrape of old paper against leather. The city seemed to dim. There she was, Elena Brooks, laughing in sunlight, 23 years old, standing beside a green streetcar in New Orleans, wearing a yellow sundress and a silver bracelet that caught the light at her wrist. The edges of the photograph were worn white from years of being touched, hidden, denied, and touched again. Jonathan forgot the town car. He forgot the meeting waiting on the 36th floor of a glass tower downtown. He forgot the cameras across the street and the name Whitmore stamped across buildings, scholarships, and hospital wings. All he saw was the face of a woman he had once loved before duty, pride, and family silence turned love into a sealed room inside him. The little girl took one tiny breath. "Her name was Elena," she said. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the photograph. "How do you know that name?" he asked, but the answer was already standing in front of him. The same. Deep brown eyes. The same steady chin. The same way of holding fear without letting it become obedience. "Because she was my mother," the girl said. "My grandma said I shouldn't bother rich people. But she also said returning what isn't yours is never bothering anybody." Jonathan looked at her then, truly looked at her, and something old shifted beneath his ribs. "What's your name?" he asked. "Maya Brooks." The last name landed harder than it should have. Brooks. Elena's name. The name he had whispered once into her hair, while brass music floated from a street corner and rain tapped gently on a motel window in Louisiana. He had been younger then, not innocent, but less armored. He had believed time would wait. He had believed letters answered themselves. He had believed silence meant choice. Maya reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out her left hand, not to ask for anything, not to show need, but because she had seen him staring at the photograph. Around her wrist was a thin silver bracelet, too large for her, held in place by a loop of blue thread. Jonathan stopped breathing. The bracelet had 2 sets of initials engraved so small they almost disappeared in the city light. JW plus EB. He remembered buying it from a woman at the French market on a humid night that smelled of powdered sugar and river water. Elena had laughed and told him it was too sentimental. He had fastened it around her wrist anyway. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. Maya looked down at it. "Mama left it for me. She said if I ever felt lost, I should remember I came from love, even if love got lost first." The words opened a door Jonathan had spent 9 years holding shut. Behind him, a woman's heels clicked sharply against the hotel steps. "Jonathan," Caroline Whitmore called, her voice bright, controlled, and just a little too fast. "There you are. The car is waiting." She appeared beside him in a cream wool coat, pearls at her throat, her smile polished enough for cameras. Then she saw the wallet in his hand, the photograph between his fingers, and the child standing in front of him. For one instant, her face changed. It was quick, barely a flicker, but Maya saw it. Jonathan saw it too. Caroline's smile returned. "Oh dear," she said. "Has this little girl taken something of yours?" Maya lifted her chin. "I returned it." Caroline glanced at the security guard. "Then I'm sure we can thank her and move along." She reached toward the wallet, but Jonathan closed it slowly and kept it in his hand. "She knows, Elena," he said. Caroline went very still. The rainwater along the curb reflected red brake lights like thin lines of warning. Maya looked from Jonathan to Caroline, and though she was only 8 years old, she understood that adults did not always lie loudly. Sometimes they lied with smooth voices, warm coats, and smiles that arrived a second late. "I didn't ask for money," Maya said, her voice clearer now. "If I wanted money, I wouldn't have returned the wallet." The words settled over the sidewalk with a strange, quiet force. Even the security guard looked down. Jonathan's eyes stayed on Caroline. How did she know about the photograph? Caroline gave a soft laugh. "Jonathan, please. People can find things online. Your life is not exactly private." But Maya shook her head. "The picture isn't online. It has a coffee stain shaped like a heart on the back." Jonathan turned the photograph over. There it was. Faded brown, small and unmistakable. His hand trembled once before he stilled it. Caroline's face lost a little color. The driver looked away, pretending not to witness the collapse of something expensive and old. Jonathan crouched down until he was closer to Maya's height. The movement shocked everyone more than shouting would have. Billionaires did not kneel on wet sidewalks. Men like Jonathan Whitmore did not lower themselves in front of hotel staff, strangers, and traffic. But he did now. "Maya," he said gently, as if her name itself deserved care. "Where is your mother?" Maya's eyes lowered to the bracelet. The blue beads in her braids clicked once in the wind. "She passed away last winter," she said. "But before that, she told me if I ever found a man named Jonathan Whitmore, I should ask him one question." Jonathan's throat tightened. "What question?" Maya looked straight at him, holding the wallet between them no longer, because the wallet had already done what it came to do. "Did you ever get her letters?" The question lingered between them long after the traffic light changed and the crowd began moving again. Jonathan Whitmore remained crouched on the damp sidewalk, staring at Maya as if the entire city had disappeared. "Did you ever get her letters?" The words echoed through memories he had spent years trying to organize into neat explanations. He remembered waiting for replies that never came. He remembered writing again and again until pride convinced him silence was an answer. He remembered standing alone in a New Orleans train station 9 years earlier, holding a bouquet he eventually threw away because Elena never arrived. For years he had told himself she had chosen another life. It was easier than wondering whether something else had happened. "No," he said quietly. "I never got any letters." Maya studied his face carefully. Children were often better than adults at recognizing truth. "That is what my mom thought," she said. "She said if you said no, then you probably never knew." Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest. Beside him, Caroline folded her arms. Jonathan, this is ridiculous, she said with a strained smile. You cannot seriously be discussing family secrets on a sidewalk because of a coincidence. Jonathan rose slowly to his feet. A coincidence, he repeated. She knows Elena's name. She has Elena's bracelet. She knows about the photograph. Caroline opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in years, Jonathan noticed how quickly she calculated every response. Maya shifted her weight and glanced toward the hotel entrance. I should probably go, she said softly. My grandma worries if I am late. Jonathan immediately turned back to her. Where is your grandmother? 3 blocks away, Maya answered. She works at Satan's church. She cleans after community dinners. The answer somehow made everything feel more real. Not a scheme, not a setup, just a little girl trying to get home before dark. Jonathan looked at his assistant. Cancel the meeting. Her eyes widened. Sir, the board flew in from Chicago. Cancel it. The assistant nodded immediately. Caroline stared at him in disbelief. You are canceling a board meeting because of this? Jonathan ignored her. Maya, would you let me walk you to your grandmother? Maya hesitated. Her mother had taught her to be careful around strangers. Her grandmother repeated the lesson almost daily. Yet this did not feel like walking with a stranger anymore. Not completely. Okay, she said. But only if I can call Grandma first. Jonathan almost smiled. That sounds like a very smart rule. A few minutes later, they were walking through the cooling evening air. The city lights reflected across puddles like scattered stars. Maya held an old cell phone against her ear while speaking to her grandmother. Jonathan stayed several feet away to give her space. Caroline followed reluctantly, her heels clicking sharply against the sidewalk. When Maya finished the call, she slipped the phone into her pocket. Grandma said I can walk with you, she announced. But she wants to meet you herself. Fair enough, Jonathan replied. They continued down the avenue. For a while neither spoke. Then Maya pointed toward a small bakery window glowing with warm yellow light. My mom used to stop whenever she smelled cinnamon rolls, she said. Jonathan froze for half a second. Elena had loved cinnamon rolls. Not because she liked sweets, but because she claimed they made every city feel friendlier. The memory arrived so suddenly it almost stole his breath. Mine too, he said before realizing how strange that sounded. Maya looked up. Really? Really? She smiled for the first time. It was small but unmistakable. Caroline noticed it and looked away. The church appeared at the end of the block, its brick walls glowing beneath soft outdoor lamps. The white steeple rose above the surrounding buildings, calm and steady against the darkening sky. Before they reached the entrance, Maya stopped. There is something else, she said. Jonathan turned toward her. What is it? She reached into her coat pocket and carefully unfolded a piece of paper that had clearly been opened many times. The edges were worn. The center crease was nearly torn through. My mom told me to keep this safe, she said. She said if I ever met you, I should show it to you. Jonathan accepted the paper with trembling fingers. Caroline immediately stiffened beside him. Slowly he unfolded it. The handwriting hit him first. He would have recognized Elena's handwriting anywhere. Every letter curved exactly the same way he remembered. His pulse quickened as he began reading. The note was short, only 3 sentences. But before he could finish the final line, Caroline suddenly went pale. And for the first time that evening, Jonathan noticed that his sister looked genuinely afraid. The evening air seemed colder as Jonathan stared at the note in his hands. The sounds of the city faded into the distance until all he could hear was the faint rustle of paper trembling between his fingers. Elena's handwriting carried him back nearly a decade in an instant. Every loop and curve was unmistakably hers. He swallowed hard and forced himself to continue reading. Jonathan, if you are reading this, then somehow fate has succeeded where I failed. I wrote to you more times than I can count. I never stopped believing you deserve to know the truth. If our child ever finds you, please do not blame her for the years between us. Jonathan felt his pulse hammering in his ears. Our child. The words seemed impossible and undeniable at the same time. Slowly, he lifted his eyes from the paper. Maya stood quietly in front of him, hands tucked into her coat pockets, waiting without expectation. She was not asking for money. She was not asking for promises. She was simply waiting for the truth to land where it belonged. Caroline took a step forward. Jonathan, she said carefully, you cannot assume a note proves anything. Her voice remained calm, but something underneath it had cracked. Jonathan turned toward her. Why are you nervous? Caroline blinked. I am not nervous. Then why did you go pale the moment you saw this letter? The question hung in the air. For the first time in years, Caroline did not have an immediate answer. Maya looked between them. She could feel a storm moving beneath words neither adult wanted to say aloud. The church doors opened before anyone could continue. A woman in her 60s stepped outside, carrying a canvas tote bag. Her silver hair was tucked beneath a knitted cap, and her warm brown eyes immediately found Maya. Relief flooded her face. There you are, sweetheart. Maya smiled and hurried toward her. Grandma. The woman wrapped an arm around her shoulders before turning her attention to Jonathan. Recognition flashed across her features. Jonathan Whitmore. Jonathan nodded. You know who I am? Elena talked about you for years. The answer struck harder than he expected. The woman stepped closer. My name is Ruth Brooks. Elena was my daughter. For a moment, none of them spoke. Ruth studied Jonathan carefully, not with admiration, not with resentment, simply with the measured gaze of someone deciding whether a person deserved trust. You received the letter, she said quietly. Jonathan lifted the folded page. Just now. Ruth glanced toward Caroline. Something changed in her expression immediately. It was subtle but unmistakable. Recognition, disappointment, perhaps even understanding. Caroline noticed it too. We have never met, Caroline said quickly. Ruth gave a small sad smile. No, but I know your name. Jonathan turned sharply. What does that mean? Ruth hesitated. The church bell overhead chimed once, its deep tone rolling across the evening sky. Not here, she said. Come inside. Minutes later, they sat around a wooden table in a small meeting room near the church kitchen. A pot of coffee rested on a side counter. The scent of fresh bread lingered from a community dinner that had ended earlier in the evening. Maya sat beside her grandmother, swinging her feet slightly above the floor. Jonathan remained silent, unable to take his eyes off the letter. Finally, Ruth opened an old metal box she had carried from a storage closet. The lid creaked softly. Inside were dozens of envelopes bound together with a faded blue ribbon. Jonathan stared. What are those? Ruth pushed the bundle toward him. The letters Elena wrote to you. His breath caught. There had to be 30 of them. Maybe more. Different envelopes. Different stamps. Different years. Some looked worn from handling. Others appeared untouched. Jonathan picked one up carefully. His name was written across the front in Elena's handwriting. Jonathan Whitmore. Manhattan, New York. Every letter addressed correctly. Every letter mailed. Every letter returned. Returned? He whispered. Ruth nodded. Every single one. Caroline suddenly looked toward the door. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But Jonathan noticed. Why were they returned, he asked. Ruth folded her hands. Because someone kept intercepting the replies. Silence filled the room. Jonathan slowly turned toward his sister. Caroline's face had become perfectly still. Too still. Maya watched both adults carefully. Her mother had once told her that when people were hiding something, they often stopped blinking. Caroline barely blinked at all. Jonathan's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Caroline. His sister finally looked at him. Tell me I am wrong. Caroline opened her mouth. No words came out. For the first time in his life, Jonathan saw fear behind her carefully controlled smile. And in that moment, before she spoke a single word, he realized the secret buried all these years might never have belonged to Elena at all. The silence inside the small church room felt heavier than the rain outside. Jonathan Whitmore stood still, staring at the stack of returned envelopes spread across the wooden table as if they were evidence of a life he had been denied without his consent. Each one carried Elena Brooks's handwriting. Each one marked with the same quiet rejection that now felt less like distance and more like interference. Caroline Whitmore remained near the wall, her posture perfectly controlled, but her hands betrayed her, fingers interlocked too tightly, knuckles pale under the warm light of the ceiling lamp. Ruth Brooks sat across from Jonathan, her presence steady, grounded, as if she had been carrying this truth for far too long alone. Maya sat beside her grandmother, legs swinging gently, watching the adults with the calm attention of a child who already understood that grown-up silence always meant something important was breaking. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low and uneven. Tell me exactly what happened. Ruth exhaled slowly, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times and still found it difficult to begin. Elena never stopped writing to you, she said. After she left New Orleans, she moved to Houston for a short time, then came back to New York when she found out she was pregnant. She wanted you to know from the beginning. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment. The memory of a younger version of himself surfaced, standing in an apartment too large for one person, convincing himself that silence meant rejection instead of distance. Ruth continued, her tone steady but heavy. Every letter she sent came back within weeks. At first she thought it was a mistake. Then she thought you were ignoring her. Eventually, she stopped sending them altogether, but she kept writing them anyway. Maya looked up at her grandmother. You said she wrote them, but did not send them? Ruth nodded gently. She needed to believe she was still speaking to you. Jonathan opened one of the envelopes again. The paper felt fragile, as if time itself had been pressing against it. Who returned them? He asked, though something in him already knew the answer. Caroline shifted slightly, but said nothing. Ruth glanced toward her. That is where things become complicated, she said carefully. Jonathan's gaze sharpened. No more vagueness, Ruth. Not anymore. A long pause filled the room. The kind of pause that did not happen naturally, but because someone was choosing to hold it in place. Ruth finally spoke. Your sister was involved. The words landed without drama, but the effect was immediate. Jonathan turned slowly toward Caroline. For a moment, Caroline tried to hold her expression steady, but the control she had built her entire life around began to fracture in small, invisible ways. Jonathan's voice dropped. Explain. Caroline let out a short breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. You are listening to a woman who worked for my mother's household and a child who found a wallet on the street, she said. This is not evidence, Jonathan. This is confusion layered on top of grief. Ruth did not raise her voice. These envelopes have postal records, dates, return stamps. Your office processed them before they ever reached you. Jonathan looked back at the letters. The truth was no longer abstract. It was physical. It was ink and paper and time that had been deliberately redirected. Maya leaned closer to her grandmother and whispered, Did she do something bad? Ruth gently placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. Sometimes adults make choices they think are protective, she said. But protection and control are not the same thing. Jonathan stepped closer to Caroline. Did you intercept her letters? Caroline's eyes flickered toward the table, then back to him. You were building your company, she said quickly. You were traveling constantly. You were unstable after father passed away. Elena was not part of your future. I made a decision to preserve what you were creating. Jonathan stared at her, as if trying to translate her words into something that made sense. You decided to erase her from my life. Caroline shook her head. I prevented chaos. You would have abandoned everything for a relationship that was already falling apart. Ruth stood slowly. That is not your decision to make, she said. Caroline turned toward her sharply. And what would you have done? Let your daughter drag him into uncertainty? Let him lose everything he had built? Maya stepped down from the chair. My mom was not chaos, she said softly. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a clarity that cut through the tension. She just wanted him to know about me. The room fell still again. Jonathan looked at Maya, really looked at her. The shape of her face, the way she held her shoulders, the quiet strength that did not ask for permission. You were never told, he said quietly, almost to himself. You grew up believing I did not respond. Ruth nodded. That is what she believed in the end. Caroline stepped forward. Jonathan, listen to me. Even if this is true, it does not change what happened afterward. You have responsibilities. A legacy. A company that depends on stability. Jonathan finally turned fully toward her. His voice was no longer confused. It was steady. You did not protect me, he said. You controlled me. Caroline's composure cracked completely for a brief moment. I protected you from regret. Jonathan looked down at the letters again. No, he said quietly. You protected yourself from consequences. Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out the small folded note her mother had given her. She placed it gently on the table beside the envelopes. She said if I ever found you, I should give you this too. Jonathan picked it up carefully. The handwriting was newer than the letters. The ink slightly darker. He unfolded it. His eyes moved across the page slowly. And as he read, something inside him shifted again, not with shock this time, but with recognition. Elena had not been asking for forgiveness. She had been asking for truth. And now, sitting in that quiet room filled with paper, memory, and silence finally breaking, Jonathan Whitmore realized the truth had been waiting for him longer than he had been ready to face it. The church room felt even smaller now, as if the walls had quietly shifted inward after the truth was spoken. Jonathan Whitmore remained standing beside the table, the letter still open in his hand, but his focus was no longer on the words. It was on everything those words had broken open inside him. Caroline Whitmore stood near the window, her reflection faint against the glass, her posture rigid in a way that no longer looked like control, but like containment, as if she was holding something inside herself that was finally becoming too heavy. Ruth Brooks did not move. Maya sat perfectly still now, her hands folded in her lap, watching Jonathan the way a child watches weather change, not because they can stop it, but because they can feel it coming. Jonathan finally broke the silence. "You knew," he said, his voice low, directed at Caroline. "You knew she was writing to me." Caroline did not answer immediately. Outside, a distant church bell rang again, softer this time, like an echo trying not to disturb what was happening inside. "I knew she was trying," Caroline said carefully. "That is not the same thing." Jonathan turned toward her fully. "You intercepted letters from the woman I loved." Caroline's expression tightened. "You were drowning in responsibility at that time. You were building Whitmore Global from nothing. Do you remember what your schedule looked like? Do you remember how many nights you slept in your office?" Jonathan shook his head slowly. "Do not change the subject." Ruth spoke quietly from across the table. "She was not trying to protect your work," she said. "She was protecting control over your life." Caroline's eyes snapped toward Ruth. "You do not understand the weight of this family." Maya looked up at that. "My mom understood weight," she said softly. "She carried me." The room fell quiet again, but this time it was different. Not empty. Tense. Alive. Jonathan walked slowly toward the table and placed the letter back down among the stack of envelopes. His movements were careful, controlled, as if any sudden motion might cause the moment to collapse entirely. "Elena never stopped looking for me," he said, almost to himself. Ruth nodded. "She came back once," she said. Jonathan looked up sharply. "What do you mean she came back?" Ruth hesitated for a moment, then reached into her tote bag and pulled out a folded hospital admission record. The paper was old, edges softened by time. She slid it across the table. Jonathan picked it up immediately. The document showed a date from 8 years earlier. The location was a public hospital in Houston. The name listed was Elena Brooks. His eyes scanned faster now, urgency replacing restraint. And then he saw it. A notation in the margin from a staff coordinator confirming an emergency contact attempt made to Jonathan Whitmore's listed business office. No response recorded. Jonathan's hand tightened around the paper. "I never received this," he said. Ruth nodded again, slower this time. "She went into labor alone that night," she said. "Maya was born a few hours later." Maya looked down at her hands, as if the weight of that fact was still something she was learning how to carry. Jonathan's voice broke slightly for the first time. "And no one told me." Caroline spoke quickly. "You were impossible to reach. You had investors in Asia. You were in transition with the merger acquisition. There was no stable channel to contact you directly." Jonathan turned toward her sharply. "Stop explaining it," he said. The words were not loud, but they were final. Caroline stopped speaking immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it. Jonathan looked back at Maya. She met his eyes without hesitation. There was no accusation in her expression, only recognition, as if she had already understood far more than she should have had to understand at her age. "You kept everything," he said quietly. Maya nodded. "My mom kept everything too," she replied, even when no one answered. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, something had shifted. Not anger, not confusion, something clearer. "Why now?" he asked Ruth. "Why did this come back to me today?" Ruth looked at Maya before answering. "Because she found you first," she said. Jonathan frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Maya reached into her pocket again and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It was different from the others. This one was newer, more fragile. She placed it on the table and pushed it toward him. "I wrote to you," she said. "After my mom passed away, I tried to find your name online. I did not know where to send it, so I just kept it." Jonathan unfolded the paper slowly. The handwriting was uneven, clearly a child's effort. He read silently. The message was simple. "I do not need anything. I just want to know if my mom told you I existed." Jonathan lowered the paper. For a long moment, No one spoke. Caroline looked away first. Ruth closed her eyes briefly, as if carrying something painful but necessary. Maya did not move. Jonathan finally stepped away from the table. He walked toward the window and looked out at the church courtyard below. The evening lights had begun to turn on one by one, soft and warm against the fading sky. His voice came quietly, almost unsteady. "She tried to reach me," he said. "All this time." Ruth stood. "Yes." Jonathan turned slightly, still facing the window. "And I never knew." Maya stood up too, slowly. She walked a few steps closer to him, but stopped at a respectful distance. "She said you were not a bad person," she said. Jonathan turned his head toward her. Maya continued. "She said sometimes people just get lost in different directions." The words hit him harder than any accusation could have. Not because they excused him, but because they did not. They simply told the truth without anger. Caroline finally spoke again, her voice quieter now. "Jonathan, whatever you think happened, the past cannot be undone." Jonathan did not look at her. "No," he said, "but it can finally be seen." He turned back toward Maya. For the first time since this began, he lowered himself slightly, not all the way to the ground, but enough that his eyes were closer to hers. "I am sorry," he said. Maya blinked once. Not surprised. Not overwhelmed. Just listening. "I am sorry I did not know," he added. The room did not react. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No sudden resolution. Only the quiet weight of truth finally acknowledged after years of silence. And in that quiet, something unfamiliar began to form. Not forgiveness yet, not closure, but the first fragile sign that neither of them would have to stand on opposite sides of this story anymore. The room remained still after Jonathan's apology, as if even the air itself was unsure whether it was allowed to move again. Maya stood quietly where she was, her small hands clasped in front of her, absorbing words that adults often spoke too late in life. Ruth Brooks watched Jonathan carefully, not with relief, but with the steady patience of someone who understood that truth was only the first step and never the last. Caroline Whitmore remained near the window, her reflection now fractured by the dimming light outside, no longer composed in the way she had been at the beginning of the evening. Jonathan finally straightened, but something in his posture had changed, as if the weight he had carried unknowingly for years had shifted direction rather than disappeared. "We cannot leave this here," he said quietly. No one asked what he meant, because everyone already understood. Maya looked up at him. "What happens now?" she asked. Jonathan hesitated, then answered honestly. "Now we find every piece of truth that was kept from us." Caroline exhaled sharply. "Jonathan, you are making this sound like an investigation instead of a misunderstanding." Jonathan turned toward her slowly. "Misunderstanding does not produce 9 years of missing letters," he said. The words were calm, but final. Ruth stepped forward. "There are hospital archives in Houston," she said. "Records do not disappear easily when you know where to look." Maya tilted her head slightly. "My mom always said papers do not lie," she said softly. Jonathan nodded once, as if accepting a decision that had already been made long before this moment. "Then we go to Houston," he said. Caroline immediately shook her head. "You cannot simply leave New York and chase every document that appears on a table," she said. "You have obligations. The board meeting, the investors, your entire company is waiting for direction." Jonathan looked at her with a calm that unsettled her more than anger ever could. "For 9 years I gave my life to obligations I thought mattered," he said. "Now I need to understand what I was not allowed to see." The silence that followed was not empty anymore. It was decision-forming. Ruth placed a hand gently on Maya's shoulder. "She should not be pulled through more confusion," she said. Jonathan looked at Maya immediately. "You will not be left out of this," he said. Maya did not respond right away. She seemed to weigh the words carefully, as children often do when they learn that promises can sometimes be heavier than they sound. Finally, she nodded once. "I want to know too," she said. Caroline stepped forward again. "This is inappropriate," she insisted. "She is a child." Maya turned toward her calmly. "I am the reason you are all talking," she said. The simplicity of her voice made the room fall quiet again. Jonathan picked up the stack of letters and carefully gathered them together. Each envelope felt heavier now, not because of paper, but because of what had been carried inside them without delivery. "We leave in the morning," he said. Ruth nodded. "I will come as well." Caroline looked between them, disbelief and frustration tightening her expression. You are all going to act as if this is settled truth, she said. Jonathan faced her. No, he replied. We are going to act as if it deserves to be proven. That answer ended the argument. Not with victory, but with inevitability. Outside the church, night had fully settled over the city. The streets glowed with reflections of passing cars, and the air carried the distant rhythm of a city that never fully stopped moving. Inside the small room, the world felt temporarily paused, as if something larger had pressed its hand gently against time itself. Jonathan walked toward the door, then stopped. He looked back at Maya. Did your mother ever describe me? He asked quietly. Maya thought for a moment. She said you were someone who always looked like he was running out of time, she answered. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly at that, because it was exactly how he had lived without realizing it. Ruth gathered her bag and stood beside Maya. Elena never hated you, she said. She just stopped being able to reach you. Jonathan nodded slowly, absorbing the difference between those two things. Caroline remained silent now, her earlier certainty replaced by something less stable. As they prepared to leave, Maya walked a few steps toward Jonathan. She looked up at him, not with hesitation, but with a kind of quiet clarity that only children seem able to carry without breaking. If we find out everything, she asked, what happens after? Jonathan knelt slightly so he could meet her eyes. For a moment he did not answer, because the truth required honesty more than comfort. Then we decide what kind of family the truth allows us to become, he said. Maya considered this, then nodded once as if accepting a responsibility she had not asked for, but understood nonetheless. Outside, the church door opened into the night, and the four of them stepped into the cool air, carrying letters, memories, and unanswered history into a future that had finally begun to move forward. The early morning light in New York had the soft gray tone that comes just before the city fully wakes, when the streets feel quieter but never truly empty. Outside the church, Jonathan Whitmore stood beside the black town car that had been waiting since the night before, though no one inside had spoken about business since leaving the room. Maya sat in the back seat, her hands resting on her knees, looking out through the window as if she was trying to memorize the direction of everything she had just stepped into. Ruth Brooks sat beside her, holding the same worn bag, her expression calm but distant, as if she had already traveled further ahead in memory than any of them had physically moved. Caroline Whitmore stood slightly apart near the curb, her coat pulled tightly around her, her posture still composed but her silence heavier than before. Jonathan closed the car door gently and turned toward the driver. LaGuardia Airport, he said. The driver nodded without question. The engine started softly, and the car pulled away from the curb, merging into the early traffic of Manhattan. Inside the vehicle, no one spoke for several minutes. The city passed by in slow motion through tinted glass, storefronts waking up, delivery trucks stopping at corners, pedestrians walking with coffee in hand, as if nothing unusual was unfolding in the world that morning. Maya finally broke the silence. Have you been on a plane with us before? She asked Jonathan. He turned slightly toward her. Not like this, he answered honestly. Ruth gave a faint smile. Some trips change more than location, she said. Caroline looked out the window, avoiding the conversation entirely. Jonathan opened the folder of documents he had brought with him, but instead of reading, he simply held them, as if their presence alone kept him anchored to what he needed to understand. The ride to the airport felt shorter than expected and longer than it should have been at the same time. When they arrived at the private terminal, the atmosphere shifted into something quieter, more controlled. There were no crowds, only staff moving with practiced efficiency, luggage being handled with careful precision, and aircraft visible in the distance like silent expectations waiting to be fulfilled. Maya held Ruth's hand as they walked across the polished floor toward the boarding gate. Jonathan walked slightly behind them, still processing everything that had changed in less than 24 hours. Caroline followed. Last, her heels clicking softly, each step measured but increasingly uncertain. Once inside the aircraft, the cabin lights were warm and subdued. The seating arrangement felt more like a private living space than a corporate asset, with wide leather seats and large windows framing the runway outside. Maya chose a seat near the window without hesitation. Ruth sat beside her. Jonathan sat across the aisle, while Caroline positioned herself further back, still maintaining distance, as if proximity itself carried risk. As the plane prepared for departure, Jonathan finally spoke again. After we land, he said, we go directly to the hospital records office in Houston. Ruth nodded. I already called ahead, she replied. There is an archivist who worked there during that time. He still remembers Elena. Maya looked up at that name, her attention sharpening. Did he know my mom? She asked. Ruth nodded gently. He helped her when she was alone. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the idea that pieces of this life had existed independently of him, fully formed, continuing forward without his awareness. The aircraft began to move, slowly at first, then gaining speed. As it lifted into the sky, the city below began to shrink into a grid of light and structure. Maya pressed her forehead lightly against the window, watching the buildings become smaller until they looked like scattered thoughts. My mom used to say flying feels like remembering from far away, she said softly. Jonathan looked at her. What did she mean? Maya thought for a moment. She said when you are high enough, everything that confused you starts to look like it was connected the whole time. The words settled into Jonathan quietly. For the first time, he began to see not just what had been hidden, but the pattern of what had been redirected. Hours later, the plane descended into Houston under a pale morning sky. The air outside felt different immediately, warmer and heavier, carrying the humidity of a place closer to earth and memory. At the airport, a black SUV waited for them, arranged by Ruth's contact at the hospital. The drive through the city passed in silence, broken only by Maya, occasionally pointing out small things she recognized from stories her mother had told her. A mural on a brick wall, a small bookstore on a corner, a park with tall oak trees. Each detail felt like fragments of a life Jonathan had never witnessed, but had somehow always been part of. When they arrived at St. Anne's Hospital Records Department, the building was older than Jonathan expected, with stone steps worn smooth by years of movement. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed softly above a reception desk where a man in his 60s looked up as they approached. Ruth stepped forward first. Mr. David Harris, she said. The man smiled faintly in recognition. Ruth Brooks, he replied. It has been a long time. Jonathan immediately stepped forward. We need access to records from 8 years ago, he said. David studied him briefly, then glanced at Maya. Something in his expression shifted subtly. Elena Brooks, he said quietly. Ruth nodded. Yes. David exhaled slowly. I was afraid this day might come eventually, he said. Caroline frowned slightly. What does that mean? David stood from his chair. It means I remember her very clearly, he replied. He looked at Jonathan. And I remember what happened when she tried to reach you again. Jonathan felt a tightness form in his chest. Then show us, he said. David hesitated only once before turning toward a locked cabinet behind him. Some records were never meant to be lost, he said. But they were certainly meant to be hidden. Maya took a small step closer to Jonathan without realizing it. He noticed, and, without thinking, lowered his hand slightly so she could hold it if she wanted to. After a moment, she did. And as David pulled out a sealed file marked with Elena's name, the next layer of truth finally began to open. The sealed file lay open on the desk like something that had been waiting years for air. Inside the records office at St. Anne's Hospital in Houston, the atmosphere had shifted into a kind of stillness that felt heavier than sound. Jonathan Whitmore stood closest to the desk, his eyes fixed on the folder David Harris had just placed in front of him. The name on the cover was unmistakable. Elena Brooks. Maya stood slightly behind Jonathan now, still holding his hand, without fully realizing she had never let go since entering the room. Ruth Brooks remained composed, though her eyes carried the weight of every year she had spent protecting what her daughter left behind. Caroline Whitmore stood near the doorway, her arms crossed, but her attention was no longer defensive. It was unsettled, as if the building itself had begun to close in around her certainty. David Harris opened the file slowly. Before I show you what is inside, he said quietly, you need to understand something. Jonathan did not look away from the folder. Then say it. David nodded. Elena came here 3 times. The room tightened immediately. Maya looked up at her grandmother. Ruth closed her eyes briefly, confirming what she already knew. David continued. The first time, she was alone. The second time, she was carrying documents. The third time, she was asking for confirmation that a message had reached its intended recipient. Jonathan's voice was low. Me? David nodded again. Yes. He turned the folder slightly, revealing the first page. A hospital intake form. A date stamped 8 years earlier. Elena Brooks. Emergency visit. Pregnancy confirmed. Under the section labeled Emergency Contact, Jonathan Whitmore's name appeared clearly, typed by hospital staff. Jonathan's fingers tightened slightly at his side. Maya leaned forward just enough to see, her small eyes scanning the paper with quiet focus. "That is my mom's writing," she said suddenly, pointing to a handwritten note in the margin. Ruth stepped closer. "She always corrected official documents," she said softly. David flipped to the next page. "This is where things became complicated," he said. It was a scanned copy of outgoing mail logs from the hospital system. Each entry showed a certified letter sent to Jonathan Whitmore's business office address in New York. Each entry had a corresponding return status marked undeliverable or redirected. Jonathan frowned slightly. "Redirected by whom?" he asked. David hesitated. Caroline shifted behind them. "That is not relevant," she said quickly. Jonathan turned slowly toward her. "Everything in this room is relevant." David continued, voice steady but quieter now. The correspondence was being intercepted after it left this facility's record system. Once it entered external processing, it never reached its destination. Maya looked between the adults. "So my mom really did try," she said. Ruth nodded. "She never stopped." Jonathan exhaled slowly, the sound almost breaking into silence. "I thought she disappeared," he said. "I thought she chose not to answer me." Ruth placed a hand gently on the table. "That is what someone wanted you to believe." Caroline's expression tightened immediately. "This is speculation," she said. But her voice lacked the firmness it once carried. David turned another page. This one was different. It was a handwritten statement from Elena herself, scanned and preserved. The handwriting was slightly uneven, as if written quickly under emotional strain. Jonathan leaned closer and read silently at first, then out loud without realizing it. "If this reaches Jonathan Whitmore, please tell him I never stopped trying to contact him. I do not know who is preventing my letters from arriving, but I know they are not reaching him. I am not asking for anything except the truth." Jonathan stopped reading. The room felt smaller again. Maya looked at him. She was not angry, she said quietly. Jonathan shook his head. "No," he said. She was waiting. David closed the folder slightly. "There is more." He opened a final section. Inside was a second hospital record, this one marked confidential transfer. Ruth immediately recognized it. Her breath caught slightly. "This should not have been in public records," she said. David nodded. "It was moved here after Elena's final visit." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "Final visit?" David paused before answering. "She came here the day before she passed away." The words did not arrive loudly, but they changed the air completely. Maya's grip on Jonathan's hand tightened instinctively. Ruth lowered her gaze. Caroline stepped back slightly, as if distance could soften impact. Jonathan's voice was barely audible. "Why did she come back?" David turned the page. "To confirm that her daughter would be documented officially in case anything happened to her." Maya blinked slowly. "She was making sure I existed somewhere," she said. Ruth nodded with quiet sadness. "She always planned for you to be found." Jonathan looked down at Maya for a long moment. Not as a stranger anymore, not as a mystery, but as something that had always been part of his life without permission or awareness. "She never gave up," he said softly. David closed the file gently. "And neither did the records," he added. Silence settled again, but this time it was different. It was no longer hiding something. It was revealing it slowly, layer by layer, like a truth that refused to remain buried any longer. Maya finally let go of Jonathan's hand, not because she wanted distance, but because she felt something inside her shift into understanding. "So what happens now?" she asked. Jonathan looked at her, then at Ruth, then briefly at Caroline, before returning his gaze to the file on the table. "Now," he said quietly, "we stop guessing and start remembering everything that was taken from us." And for the first time since this journey began, no one in the room disagreed. The morning light in Houston filtered through the large glass windows of the hospital records office, as if it was trying to soften the weight of what had just been uncovered. Jonathan Whitmore stood still beside the desk where the final folder had been opened, his eyes no longer scanning documents but absorbing something far heavier than paper. Maya stood close to him again, her presence quiet but steady, as if she had already learned that truth sometimes required simply staying in place. Ruth Brooks remained seated now, her hands folded, her expression calmer than before, as though a long storm had finally begun to settle into understanding. Caroline Whitmore stood farther back than anyone else, her posture unchanged, but her certainty fractured in ways she could no longer hide behind words. The archivist, David Harris, had stepped aside, giving them space, though his eyes remained attentive, aware that what was unfolding was no longer just history but consequence. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice quiet but no longer uncertain. "Everything here confirms she tried," he said. No one responded immediately because there was nothing left to deny in the documents laid across the table. Maya looked up at him. "Then why did no one tell you?" she asked. The question was simple, but it landed like something far more complex. Jonathan turned slightly toward Caroline. For a long moment, she did not answer. The air between them felt dense, as if every word she might speak had to pass through layers of years before reaching the present. Ruth finally stood. "This did not happen by accident," she said softly. Caroline closed her eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. "I did what I thought was necessary," she said. Jonathan's voice was controlled. "Necessary for what?" Caroline looked at him directly now. "For you," she said. "You were building something larger than any personal attachment. Elena was not part of that future. She would have pulled you into a life you were not ready to balance." Maya took a small step forward without hesitation. "My mom was not a distraction," she said. Her voice was calm, but firm in a way that made even the adults pause. Jonathan turned toward her immediately, as if grounding himself in her presence. "No," he said quietly. "She was not." Caroline exhaled slowly. "You think you understand this now because of documents and stories," she said. "But at the time, every decision I made was about protecting what our family had built." Ruth responded first. "Protection that requires erasing another human being is not protection," she said. The words hung in the room without need for further explanation. Jonathan stepped away from the table, walking slowly toward the window at the far end of the office. Outside, Houston moved in its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the unraveling happening inside a quiet institutional room. "She wrote to me while carrying Maya," Jonathan said, more to himself than anyone else. "She believed I would respond." Maya stood beside Ruth now, watching him. "She believed in you," she corrected gently. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. Not anger, not confusion. Something clearer, heavier, more focused. "Then we owe her more than understanding," he said. Caroline looked at him sharply. "What are you saying?" Jonathan turned back toward the table. He placed his hand gently on the stack of letters. "We finish what she started," he said. Ruth nodded once, as if she had been expecting this conclusion from the beginning. Maya tilted her head slightly. "How do you finish something like this?" she asked. Jonathan looked at her. "By making sure the truth is no longer something that depends on hidden rooms or forgotten records," he said. "By making sure you are not hidden from anything ever again." Caroline's voice softened slightly, though uncertainty remained. "And what about everything else? The company, the public, the consequences of reopening this?" Jonathan met her gaze steadily. "If my life was built on a version of truth that could be redirected by silence," he said, "then it was never as stable as I believed." The archivist cleared his throat quietly from the side of the room. "There is one more thing," David said. Everyone turned toward him. He walked back to the desk and retrieved a small sealed envelope that had been stored separately from the main file. "This was not part of the official record," he explained. "It was delivered to the hospital after Elena's passing, with instructions that it only be opened if Jonathan Whitmore ever came in person to request full access." Jonathan approached slowly and accepted the envelope. The paper felt different from the others. Lighter, but more deliberate. Maya stood beside him again without hesitation. Ruth remained still, watching. Caroline did not move. Jonathan opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single handwritten page. As his eyes moved across the lines, the room seemed to fall away around him again, but this time without confusion, only recognition. Maya watched his expression shift subtly, waiting without fear. When he finished reading, Jonathan lowered the paper slowly. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he looked at Maya, not as a mystery, not as a discovery, but as something real that had always been waiting. "She named what happens next," he said quietly. Maya's voice was soft. What did she say? Jonathan knelt slightly, so his eyes met hers at the same level. She said truth is not the end of a story, he replied. It is where responsibility begins. And in that moment, surrounded by years of hidden letters, sealed records, and voices finally heard, the past stopped being something they were chasing and became something they were finally ready to live with.